Islands in the Sun, the story of reggae and Calypso. In this recorded discussion, Jim Smith, who is head of the music department at the Royal Grammar School in Worcester, talks to Felix Cross, composer, performer and artist-in-residence at Goldsmiths College at the University of London. The discussion on side 1 looks at the recent development of reggae music, and side 2 outlines the history of Calypso. Jim Smith.
First of all, we're going to hear 2 short pieces of music. Here's the first. And now the second. Both those pieces sound different, yet they're connected with each other. Felix, can you explain to us the connection?
Yes, Jim. The first piece was an example of typical American rhythm and blues, straight out of the 40s and 50s. If you listen to people like Ray Charles, Fats Waller and others from that time, you'll hear what I mean. The second track was an example of dub reggae from Jamaica in the 70s. Joe Gibbs, Lee Perry were and still are important figures in this field. So, one is black popular music from America 30 years ago, and the other is black popular music from Jamaica over the last decade. In fact, the connection's much stronger than that. What I want to show on this tape is how rhythm and blues from the States developed over these last 30 years into reggae from Jamaica.
So, are you saying that the roots of reggae are in America?
Well, ultimately, the roots are in Africa. The slaves that were shipped over to America in the late 17th and 18th centuries brought with them the sort of music that developed into gospel and blues. Later on, along with industrialization and the migration to the big cities, blues took 2 distinctive paths. One was towards jazz, and the other was blues with rhythm, particularly for dancing, rhythm and blues.
Before we get on to the step from rhythm and blues to reggae, let's have a look at the importance of reggae in popular music today, for its influence spreads right across the musical board, doesn't it?
Yes. It's not only bands like The Police that have used reggae as a direct influence. The Clash, Madness. I can even think of tunes by Bucks Fizz that have strong traces of reggae in them. These days, reggae has been played all over the world. Listen to UB40, Aswad, and Musical Youth from England. There are even African reggae bands, which completes a neat cycle, doesn't it?
Right. The story of reggae is very much a geographical story, then, having developed from Jamaica's location as the most northerly of the West Indian islands.
Well, I guess it is geographical in the sense that Jamaica was close enough to the States for American music radio stations to be picked up on the island. Also, during the Second World War, a lot of American soldiers were based in Jamaica. They brought R&B records with them, and it remained popular there for many years. Another interesting fact is that as well as R&B, Singers like Bing Crosby, Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra were very popular on the island. These smooth-voiced singers were called crooners, and they'd later influence reggae singers such as Gregory Isaacs and the lovers rock style.
So black Jamaicans identified with black Americans?
Yeah. Remember, this was before the great civil rights struggles and advances of the 60s in America. Racial persecution was widespread, and black Jamaicans could easily recognise the sentiments expressed in many R&B songs.
And presumably this led to a great demand in Jamaica for R&B records from the north.
A fantastic demand, not only for the well-known records. There was great rivalry between individual record stores in Jamaica to see who could supply the most obscure and hard-to-obtain R&B from the US. And in order to attract customers away from their competitors, they would hitch up these massive loudspeakers outside their shops and play these obscure records as loud as they could. Later, they set these up in halls or in outdoor arenas as proper shows in themselves. DJs would talk over the records with a microphone to entertain their supporters. This was the beginning of modern-day sound systems and toasters such as iRoy, Big Youth and Dillinger.
Can you explain toasters for us?
That was the name they gave to these DJs who talked over the records. Some of them were so good at it that the audience preferred their version to the original records.
Now, by the end of the 1950s, rhythm and blues was dying out in the States, where the road was being prepared for the advent of rock and roll. Whereas in Jamaica, rhythm and blues was still very popular, wasn't it?
Well, what happened was that, although in the US, rhythm and blues had run its course, people in Jamaica still wanted as much of it as they could get. So some of the record stores, which had a spare room at the back, began to set up small recording studios. The plan was to use local musicians to imitate the American music. I don't know whether they intended to make out that the records were actually American, but it never worked out that way.
What happened?
Well, if you listen to the rhythm of R&B, you'll hear that it goes like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And so on. The guitar played this sort of pattern. But when the Jamaican musicians got hold of it, they played it slightly differently. Instead of this, 1, 2, 3, 4, they played this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3. You can immediately tell the difference. It's all on the upbeat. They called it ska, which was the new sound they heard the guitar making, like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Where do bluebeat and rock steady fit into all this?
They were really the bridge between ska and reggae of the 70s. You see, one of the problems with ska was that constant offbeat. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and... It was too strong, too repetitive for anything other than fast dance music. All those singers who wanted to sound like Bing Crosby needed a slower, more open style to sing to. So what happened was this. They took the basic rhythm, 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and... But instead of playing all those offbeats like this, 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and... They began to emphasise just the third beat in each bar, like this. 1, 2, and 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So, although the speed of the song stayed the same, the effect was to make it appear slower and much more versatile. Have a listen to this next example, and while you're doing that, count 1, 2, 3, 4, and hear how all the weight falls on that third beat.
It's rhythm, isn't it, that really gives reggae its distinctive sound. But are there any instruments peculiar to reggae which contribute to the overall effect?
Not really the usual drums, bass, a couple of electric guitars, keyboards and percussion, but they were played slightly differently. Apart from bass guitar, all the sounds were made as short and as percussive as possible, and in the studios they used echo units to repeat the beats and make the rhythm more interesting, like this, sort of 1, 2, da 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 da, chak 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 chak, chak 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 chak.
Right, well, let's go on to 1964 now, Felix, when a reggae number, My Boy Lollipop by Millie Small, was at the top of the hit parade. This really must have signalled that reggae in Britain had arrived.
Well, My Boy Lollipop was really a ska tune, and although some artists around the mid to late 60s were quite popular, like the Upsetters, Pioneers, Harry J and Prince Buster, reggae had to wait till March 1969 for its first #1 hit record in England with Desmond Decker's Israelites.
Get up in the morning, slaving for bread, sir, so that every mouth can be fed. Oh, me Israelites. What on my kids, step up and I leave me. Darling, she said I was yours to receive. Oh, me Israelites. Shut them a tear up choices ago. I don't want to end up like Bonnie and Clyde. Oh, me Israelites. After a song, there must be a promise to catch me in the palm. You sound your alarm. Oh, me Israelites. Get up in the morning, saving for bread, sir, so that every mouth can be fed. The Israelites, sir. I said my wife, I must get to the back up and I leave me. Darling, she said I was yours to receive. The Israelites, sir. Look, me trust them a tear up choices ago. I don't want to end up like Bonnie and Clyde. Oh, me Israelites. After a song, there must be a coming. Put you in the palm, you sound your alarm. Oh, me Israelites. Yeah. I'm wondering, I'm working so hard. Look down on me,
And yet, if you were to follow the British media, radio, television and so on, you wouldn't have believed that reggae existed, would you? So little of it was played.
Yes, the music industry establishment seemed to deliberately ignore reggae. It was really kept alive in this country by kids playing it in clubs.
And then in 1972 there was Jimmy Cliff in the film The Harder They Come, which gave a considerable boost to the popularity of reggae.
Yes, the film not only had some great music in it, especially the title track, but also gave us a good insight into the background which gave rise to the Jamaican music business. A lot of hustlers and gangsters with guns and motorbikes. They called the kids rude boys, and the skinheads over here of the mid to late 60s were modelled after them.
So far we haven't mentioned Rastafarianism, and yet it does seem strange that both Rastafarians and skinheads, who'd appear on the surface to be poles apart, adopted the same music.
Well, for skinheads, it was really a dance music. They adopted it in its ska blue beat phase, when it was played in those clubs. But for Rastas, it was a vehicle for their religiously inspired lyrics. Bob Marley's Exodus, for example.
And no history of reggae would be complete without mention of him.
Well, right. But whilst it's true that he, more than any other reggae artist, pushed reggae into the forefront of popular music, his contributions were really as a songwriter and a performer. He wasn't so important when it came to a purely musical development. It was the messages in his lyrics, Songs like Exodus, 400 Years, Slave Driver, and Get Up, Stand Up that got him the popularity he achieved. When he first became noticed, reggae was still largely unknown to the masses, and even amongst pop fans it was a victim of fashionable musical snobbery. When he died, it had become probably the single most influential pop style of the last decade. All that was nearly all down to him.
So was he important in the studio side of reggae?
If you mean dub and toasting, then no, not at all. This is where the traditions handed down by people like Lee Perry and Joe Gibbs came into play. You see, although as producers they may not have actually played on a record, they would be in overall control of the sound.
You mean by directing the musicians as to what they should play exactly, and by being in control of all the knobs and buttons for the mixing down of all the individual instruments to make the final record?
Yes, and from quite an early stage they began experimenting. First it was simply to leave out the vocal track and only keep the backing music. They often put this version on the B-side, and at the big sound system shows, the DJ would sing over the music. This often became more popular than the original with the vocals on.
Can you give us an example of dub reggae?
Well, first, here is a typical sort of reggae that could have come out of the late 70s. Now, the producer in the studio has total control over each individual instrument. He could decide to leave out the bass guitar for a while, or only have the drums. Now, this is a short dub version of the example I played just now. Listen to people like Iroy and Big Youth, as well as the earlier guys, from some good dub effects.
So where does reggae go from here? Any ideas?
Well, as with any recent history, the events are too close for us to see it in perspective, so it is very difficult to say which one of the current artists or styles would be lasting. But, as well as influencing the rest of the world, it is in turn being influenced itself by all sorts of popular music. However, it is extraordinary that from this one small island in the West Indies, Jamaica, they've developed ska, Bob Marley, Rastafarianism and rude boys, dub reggae, toasters. It's been a good 30 years music.
A man has money today, people do not care if he has cocoa beer. If a man has money today, people do not care if he has cocoa beer. He can commit murder and get off free and live in the governor's company. But if you are poor, people will tell you sure, and a dog is better than you. You have money to buy in a store, the boss will shake your hands at the door. Call 10 clerks to take down everything, whiskey, cloth, earring, and diamond ring. He may send them to your house on a motorbike. You can pay the bills whenever you like. Not a soul will ask you a thing. They know very well that money is king.
This side of the recording is concerned with Calypso. The piece of music you just heard is Money is King by the Growling Tiger. Felix, Calypso basically is a form of information gathering, isn't it?
Well, it's more than that, really. Wit, satire, political and social commentary, as well as the basic information side, are all parts of Calypso. For example, the lyrics to that last song are, if a man has money today, people don't care if he has cocoa bay. He can commit murder and get off free and live in the governor's company, but if you are poor, the people tell you shoo, and a dog is better than you. However, they're also the humorous and usually rude, what they call bacchanalian lyrics. It's probably safer to say that most Calypso songs have some sort of story attached to them.
And the tradition of this storytelling must go back a long way.
Yes, it dates right back to the griots in West Africa, before the days of slavery. The griots were sort of tribal historians, songs telling the history of the village or the tribe, with any special events that may have happened along the way, would be learnt by the griots. They would add any new ones they made up themselves before passing the whole lot on to the next generation. Also, they would be called on to perform at all the village's important occasions. They were highly thought of and important people in the village. Then, with slavery, many traditions were brought from Africa to the West Indies. As well as a story and news-telling element, the most important thing musically, of course, was drumming.
What was the significance of drumming like that?
Well, in Africa, it was an integral part of the language. We've all heard of talking drums. Well, it's actually possible to say things like, the sun is shining brightly, the harvest is ready, through drumming. The problem, of course, in the West Indies was that through slavery, people of different tribes and cultures were thrown together. Language barriers arose, and new ways had to be found of communicating. For example, the limbo dance, originated in the West Indies, describes the cramped conditions under which the slaves were transported there.
Suppression in history has often produced rebellion, hasn't it? And Calypso's an example. An example, in this case, of an art form created as a result of suppression.
Well, for the slaves, it was in their songs, which they sang in their own language, that they could attack those that chained and oppressed them. And in poking fun at them, they developed this strong satirical element that is such an important part of Calypso. As long as the slave owners couldn't understand the words that were being sung, everything was all right. The slaves could smile at them whilst poking fun or threatening them with awful retribution, and the owners were none the wiser.
Are you saying that the lyrics of Calypso became subversive in order to give a double-edged meaning to whites and blacks?
Yes, it was only at the beginning of this century that Calypsos were sung in English. Even though this was nearly 70 years after the end of slavery, there were still grave injustices done to the black population. When English began to be used, the authorities were horrified at what was being sung. Naturally, the first thing they did was try to ban it.
They'd managed to ban drumming on the island.
Well, you can imagine that the average slave owner lived in perpetual fear of uprisings and reprisals. And justifiably so. For a white man stuck out in his plantation, surrounded only by slaves who hated him, the sound of mass drumming was terrifying. It inevitably meant that some illicit gathering was taking place, possibly religious and therefore illegal, or some terrible plot was being carried out.
The first island where slaves did rebel successfully being Haiti.
And this was very important for the development of the arts in Haiti and the rest of the West Indies. You see, the rebellion took place soon after the slaves arrived, so that in 1804, the ex-slaves set up their own government and became the world's first black republic. This meant that on that island, there had been comparatively little time for European culture to influence the slaves.
Almost as soon as they'd been brought to the island, they rebelled and threw out the Europeans.
Right. So whilst all the other islands became influenced by all sorts of cultures, Haiti remained, and still is, very African. If you listen to its music, you can hear that quite clearly. The other important thing that this rebellion brought about was that those Europeans who survived it were nearly all French. They escaped south to the smaller islands, and many of them settled as far south as Trinidad.
Why was that so important?
Well, they not only influenced the language a lot. For many years, most of those islands spoke a mixture of French and African. They also brought with them their Roman Catholicism, and one of its annual festivals in particular. On the Monday and Tuesday before Ash Wednesday, which is the beginning of Lent, they would parade up and down the streets in masks and fancy dress. There would be great merriment with lots of eating and drinking. This was because they knew that come Ash Wednesday morning, the Lenten period would begin, and for 40 days and nights they weren't allowed to eat meat, drink alcohol, or indulge in anything like playing music, dancing, or singing. So this pre-Lenten celebration was called Carnaval, which was Latin and meant literally farewell to the flesh. Which sounds a bit dramatic, but it was basically a final binge before 40 days and nights of total abstinence.
Oh, so this is where the Carnival of Trinidad comes from. Is it the same as the one in Brazil?
Yes, if you look at any Roman Catholic country, you'll find they celebrate this period.
And how does all this relate to Calypso?
Well, after slavery was abolished, the ex-slaves took over the festival, much to the annoyance of the Europeans. Calypso really developed as the music that was sung on this occasion.
Wasn't there another element called stick fighting that was found in Carnival?
Stick fighting was a form of African martial arts that was very popular in the West Indies. It was similar to the old Robin Hood and Little John quarterstaff fighting. Each district had its own champion. At various times, and especially during Carnival, all the champions would meet to do battle. It was a one-to-one form of fighting, so all over town there would be crowds gathering round contests. The people from each district came to support their own champion by singing songs that ridiculed the opponent or praised their hero. For example, this song in its English translation says, "Since my mother made me, man never beat me in battle." Not exactly poetry, but in its original language, a mixture of French and African, it sounds like this. "Depe mama fe mue, non pakaba nue bois, en batailla." Much better. Around these stick-fighting contests, a lead singer emerged. He or she would compose the songs that the rest would learn and sing the chorus to.
That lead singer's role would be like the griots in West Africa that we spoke of at the beginning.
Similar, only these people were called chanteuils, from the French chanter, to sing.
All this stick fighting and singing business sounds pretty noisy and violent. I'm surprised that the authorities, having banned drumming, allowed it at all.
They didn't. Stick fighting was banned, along with drumming in any religion that wasn't Christian.
Well, if drumming was banned, what did they use for music?
They used a thing called tambu bamboo. This was different lengths of hollow bamboo poles, held upright and beaten on the ground. The different lengths gave different pitches of sound. They also used short sticks beaten together or against the side of a bottle. That was Tambu Bambu, and this is what it sounds like.
How long did this form of music last?
Right up until the mid-1930s, really. But of course, during this time, calypsos were still being written and sung.
Were they only political, or were they about other things as well?
Well, one of the most important aspects of calypso has always been topicality. Songs would be written about important cricket matches or local elections. They didn't need to be political. Love songs were common. Here is a song that combines topicality and romance. The singer's name is the Caresser, and the song is called Edward VIII.
It's love alone that caused King Edward to leave the throne. It's love alone that caused King Edward to leave the throne. We know Edward is noble and great, but love caused him to abdicate. It's love alone that caused King Edward to leave the throne. Oh, what a sad disappointment was endured by the British government. It's love alone that caused King Edward to leave the throne. On the 10th of December we heard a talk that he gave the throne to the Duke of York. It's love alone that caused King Edward to leave the throne. I'm sorry my mother is going to grieve, but I cannot help, I'm bound to leave. It's love alone that caused King Edward to leave the throne. Paul Baldwin tried to break down his plan. He said, come what may, the American. It's love alone that caused King Edward to leave the throne. We got the money, we got the talk and the fancy walk just to suit New York. It's love alone that caused King Edward to leave the throne. And if I can't get the boat to set me free, well, I'll walk to Miss Simpson across the sea. It's love alone that caused King Edward to leave the throne.
We've had drumming, we've had tambu bambu, and by the end of the Second World War we have steel drums. How did these appear?
Well, just before the war, people had begun to experiment with other percussion sounds. Remember, drumming was still not allowed. Metallic sounds from dustbins, kettles, frying pans, and any old pieces of iron were used to try and create louder and more exciting noises. In 1937, a man calling himself Lord Humbugger led a masquerade troupe called Alexander's Ragtime Band, after a popular song of the time. The instruments he chose to accompany his band of carnival revellers were entirely made up of old bits of metal. This was the first steel orchestra. Of course, 2 years later, carnival was banned for the period of the Second World War.
Yes, and the Americans have a part to play here, don't they? Because while their soldiers were in Trinidad, they used a great deal of fuel, and it was the oil drums they left behind which were to prove ideal for creating the new sound of steel drums.
Right. They soon discovered that the metal used to make those oil drums was superior to those of dustbins. The would-be instrument makers learnt how to tune them, and by the end of the war, players were beginning a style and technique that would eventually become highly sophisticated.
Let's return to Calypso. Calypso, whose rebellious nature was pre-20th century aimed at slavery, and in the 1900s voiced against colonialism. It was, in other words, all part of the move towards independence.
Yes, and this culminated in the mid-50s with the formation of the People's National Movement, the PNM. New singers like the mighty Sparrow emerged. He was probably the most famous of them all, the Bob Marley of Calypso. The Calypsonians of the 30s and 40s, with fabulous names like Attila the Hun and Growling Tiger, Though many of them were great and very accurate in their satirical attacks, they didn't seem to speak for the mass of the people as much as Sparrow did.
I must live from a land so far. I was caught and I was brought here from Africa. I must live from a land so far. I was caught and I was brought here from Africa. Well, it was lit like fire from the wisely master every day down on the knees. Weeks and weeks before we crossed the seas to reach in the West Indies. And then they made me work. Oh yes, I work. A good Lord, okay. I toil and toil and toil and toil so hard each day. I'm dying. Yeah, I'm crying. Oh Lord, I wanna be free.
He symbolised the optimism of a comparatively wealthy nation that was soon to become independent and throw off the old colonial shackles. This was also happening throughout the West Indies, but it was really only in Trinidad, where Calypso had developed, that the songs were sung about it.
Any music, like any art form, has to develop with the times if it's to survive and not just become a quaint museum relic. Soca is the most recent development of Calypso. What exactly is soca?
Well, the word soca, spelt S-O-C-A, is a neat mixture of the first two letters of the word soul, S-O, and calypso, C-A. This time the lyrics have taken the back seat, and it's the music which has become more sophisticated. And unfortunately, this means a lot of it sounds a bit like New York disco music.
Which itself was influenced by Calypso in the 60s.
Right. The singers and bands themselves don't mind this, as it means they sell more records abroad.
However, by becoming more internationally accepted, Calypso's had to pay the price of losing much of its originality and biting lyrics.
That's mostly true. However, there are still a few singers around, people like Chalk Dust, Shadow, and one or two others, who can write good lyrics in the Calypso tradition. Although, of course, it could well be argued that a comparatively wealthy and modern nation like Trinidad, with all its technological resources, has got much less to complain about and therefore sing about these days.
So Calypso, in this new form of soca, is more associated with dancing than with political or social comment. And this brings us to the all-important question of rhythm. Tell us a bit about the rhythmic features of Calypso.
Okay. Now, the basic rhythm for Calypso is quite difficult. If you take one bar of most European music, you'll hear that it probably has 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are called the on-beats. In between each on-beat is an off-beat, so the bar now sounds like this: 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. The ands being the off-beats. So far, so good? Right. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and is really 8 half-beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So instead of saying 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, we shall count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, for Calypso, we take those 8 half-beats and divide them up differently. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. which, when played fast, sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Try and hear that basic 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2 in this piece of drumming. Now, I'll add a few other instruments to colour the rhythm pattern a bit. I'll put on this cowbell rhythm. And this cabassa pattern. And here's a few more. Now I'll add a bit of guitar and bass guitar, some saxophone, and we have a tune which I call Tin Pot Calypso.